Racist police officer humiliates black veteran, not knowing he is police captain's father. An ordinary afternoon at a coffee shop takes a dark turn when a racist officer abuses his power, targeting a quiet black veteran. What he doesn't realize is that his victim is no ordinary man, and karma is about to deliver a lesson he'll never forget. How far will arrogance go before karma strikes? Watch as this gripping story unfolds. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful tales like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air at Wilson's Coffee House, a cozy establishment tucked into the corner of a bustling street. It was mid-afternoon, and the usual hum of conversation was subdued. Most patrons were lost in their own worlds, working on laptops, chatting quietly, or simply enjoying a break from their day. At a small table by the window sat Henry Williams, a dignified black man in his 60s. His presence was calm and unassuming. Henry was dressed in a modest jacket adorned with several military service pins, hinting at a storied past. In his hands was a worn, leather-bound book, his reading glasses perched on his nose as sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating his graying hair. The barista, a young man named Sam, smiled as he placed a refill on Henry's table. "Another cup for the best storyteller in town," he said. "Thanks, Sam," Henry replied warmly, his voice steady and kind. The chime of the coffee shop door announced the arrival of Officer Luke McKinley, a tall, broad-shouldered white man in his early 40s. His police uniform seemed almost too tight, his belt weighed down with authority. McKinley's eyes scanned the room, his face set in a perpetual scowl. He walked to the counter, barking his order, "Large black coffee, to go, make it quick." His tone immediately silenced the barista's usual cheer. Sam nodded nervously and began preparing the drink. As McKinley waited, his gaze wandered, landing on Henry by the window. The sight seemed to irritate him. His eyes narrowed as he muttered under his breath, "Another one sitting around, taking up space." When his coffee was ready, McKinley didn't leave. Instead, he turned and strode purposefully toward Henry's table. Henry glanced up from his book as McKinley's shadow loomed over him. The officer's voice cut through the quiet. "You planning on ordering anything else, or are you just loitering here?" Henry blinked, momentarily confused. "Excuse me." "You heard me," McKinley snapped. "This isn't a shelter. If you're not buying anything, you need to move along." Henry calmly set his book down and gestured to the steaming cup on the table. "I've been a paying customer here for years. Is there a problem, officer?" McKinley crossed his arms, his tone growing sharper. "The problem is people like you thinking you can do whatever you want." A hush fell over the coffee shop as nearby patrons turned to watch the scene unfold. Sam froze behind the counter, his hands gripping a coffee pot. Henry's voice remained steady, though there was steel in his gaze. "People like me? I'm just here, minding my business. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my coffee in peace." McKinley bristled, his authority feeling challenged. "Don't get smart with me, old man. I'm giving you a warning. Leave now, or I'll make you leave." Henry's composure remained unshaken. "I don't think you have the right to remove me from a public establishment when I've done nothing wrong." The officer's patience snapped. "That's it." He grabbed Henry's arm, yanking him from his seat. The book fell to the floor with a thud, and the coffee cup tipped, spilling its contents across the table. Gasps echoed through the shop as McKinley dragged Henry toward the door. "Out! Now!" the officer growled. Henry winced, but didn't resist. As McKinley shoved him out the door, Henry stumbled, his jacket tearing in the process. Beneath the torn fabric, a jagged scar on Henry's shoulder was briefly visible, evidence of battles fought long ago. Henry straightened himself with quiet dignity, brushing dust from his jacket. He turned to McKinley, who stood in the doorway, chest puffed out in misplaced pride. "You might wear that badge," Henry said evenly, "but you don't understand what it truly means to serve." McKinley scoffed. "Save the lecture." He turned and walked back inside, leaving Henry standing alone on the sidewalk. Inside the shop, patrons whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. Sam hesitated before stepping forward, his voice trembling as he said, "That was uncalled for, officer. He's a veteran." "Doesn't matter who he is," McKinley shot back. "The law's the law." Outside, Henry adjusted his jacket and walked away, his steps steady but heavy with unspoken pain. He glanced back at the coffee shop once, not in anger but in quiet resolve. The dining room was warmly lit, filled with the smell of roasted vegetables and spices. Captain Rachel McKinley, the youngest police captain in the precinct's history, was seated at the head of the table. Her sharp features softened when she was around her father, Henry Williams, who sat across from her, quietly sipping tea. Dinner was a sacred time for them, a moment to reconnect after their busy lives often pulled them in different directions. Rachel admired her father deeply. His wisdom and strength had been her guiding light growing up. "You're quiet tonight, Dad," Rachel said, breaking the silence. Henry looked up, his face unreadable. "Just thinking, sweetheart. Something happened today." Rachel set down her fork, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" Henry hesitated, as if weighing how much to share. "I had a run-in with one of your officers. It wasn't pleasant." The statement hit Rachel like a blow. Her posture stiffened. "What do you mean? Who? What happened?" Henry held up a hand to calm her. "Now, don't go flying off the handle. It's not worth all that. Just some officer with a chip on his shoulder. Thought I was loitering at the coffee shop and decided to make a scene." Rachel's voice grew sharp. "Did he lay a hand on you?" Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his torn jacket, which he'd draped over the back of his chair. "Let's just say he wasn't gentle. Look what he did to this." He held up the jacket, the tear revealing the faded scar on his shoulder. Rachel's face darkened as anger flickered in her eyes. "He did this to you?" "That's not just a misunderstanding, Dad. That's misconduct." Henry sighed. "It's nothing I haven't faced before. I've lived long enough to know how some people see me before I even open my mouth. I won't let it eat at me." "But I will," Rachel said firmly. Her voice carried the authority of a leader, but beneath it was the fierce protectiveness of a daughter. "I need to know who this officer is. Did you get his name?" Henry shook his head. "Didn't catch it. But I remember his face. Arrogant. Thought the badge made him untouchable." Rachel clenched her jaw. "I'll find out. Trust me." The next morning, Rachel arrived at the precinct earlier than usual, her mind racing. She'd run the department with a strict code of accountability, determined to root out the kind of behavior that tarnished the badge. The thought of one of her officers assaulting an innocent man, especially her father, boiled her blood. She called in her deputy, Sergeant Bennett, a reliable and detail-oriented officer. "I need to know if there were any incidents yesterday involving an officer at Wilson's Coffee House," Rachel said, her tone sharp and no nonsense. Bennett nodded, pulling up the precinct's incident logs. "Looks like there was something," he said after a moment. Officer Luke McKinley filed a brief report about removing an uncooperative individual from the premises. Didn't go into much detail, though. Rachel froze. "Luke McKinley? Are you sure?" Bennett nodded. Yeah, that's his name. Why? Rachel didn't answer. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Of all the officers, it had to be Luke, a man who'd already been on her radar for minor complaints about his temper and arrogance. She'd given him the benefit of the doubt, believing he could be rehabilitated. But this was unforgivable. Rachel summoned Luke McKinley to her office later that day. He entered with his usual swagger, completely unaware of the storm brewing. "You wanted to see me, Captain," he said, smirking slightly. Rachel didn't return the smile. She leaned forward, her piercing gaze locked onto his. "I need you to walk me through an incident that happened yesterday at Wilson's Coffee House. Take me through it, step by step." Luke shrugged, his arrogance on full display. "Not much to tell, Captain. Some guy was hanging around, acting suspicious. Didn't listen when I told him to leave, so I escorted him out. End of story." "Suspicious," Rachel repeated, her voice calm but laced with an edge. "What exactly was suspicious about him?" Luke hesitated, sensing the tension but too proud to backpedal. "You know how it is, Captain. Some people don't belong in certain places. He got mouthy, so I handled it." Rachel's hands curled into fists under the desk, but her voice remained steady. "And by handled it, you mean you assaulted an unarmed man, tore his jacket, humiliated him in front of a room full of witnesses?" Luke blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, how do you—" "That man," Rachel cut him off, her voice rising, "is Henry Williams, a decorated veteran, a respected member of this community. And, in case you didn't figure it out yet, he's my father." The color drained from Luke's face. His smirk vanished, replaced by panic. "Captain, I didn't know." "No, you didn't," Rachel snapped. "And that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't care to know. You saw a black man sitting in a coffee shop and decided he didn't belong. You abused your power, and now you're going to face the consequences." Luke tried to stammer out an apology, but Rachel silenced him with a glare. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Internal Affairs will be conducting a full investigation into your conduct, and I'll personally make sure this precinct no longer tolerates officers like you." As Luke stumbled out of her, Rachel sat in her office, seething but resolute. Her father's calm dignity echoed in her mind, and she vowed to make things right, not just for him, but for every person who had ever been mistreated by someone sworn to protect them. The precinct buzzed with its usual hum of activity, but Luke McKinley's suspension had sent ripples through the ranks. Whispers followed him as he gathered his belongings from his desk. His colleagues exchanged glances, some silent in judgment, others indifferent. Luke had always carried himself with an air of invincibility, believing his badge shielded him from scrutiny. Now, that armor was shattered. As he walked out of the precinct under the watchful eyes of his peers, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced before. Captain Rachel McKinley stood in her office, watching through the blinds as Luke left. Her face was a mask of calm professionalism, but inside, a storm raged. This wasn't just about her father. It was about the culture she had sworn to change. She turned to Sergeant Bennett, who had entered quietly. "Begin the internal review immediately," she ordered. "I want every complaint, every incident involving McKinley on my desk by tomorrow morning." Bennett nodded. "Understood, Captain. What about your father? Is he okay?" Rachel's expression softened for a moment. "He's fine. More fine than I am, honestly. But this is bigger than him. We need to do better, Bennett. We need to be better." Later that evening, Rachel visited her father at his home. The modest house was filled with reminders of Henry's life. A framed photo of him in his army uniform, medals displayed in a glass case, and a well-worn armchair by the fireplace. Henry greeted her at the door, his usual warm smile in place. "You didn't have to come all the way out here, sweetheart. I'm fine." "I know," Rachel said, stepping inside. "But I needed to see you." They sat together in the living room, Rachel staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. She hadn't realized how tightly wound she'd been until she was here, in her father's presence. "I suspended him," she said finally. Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. But suspension isn't justice, Rachel. It's just the beginning." "I know," she said, "but it's a step in the right direction. I won't let him get away with what he did to you or anyone else." Henry leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You know, I've faced men like him my entire life. It's not just about him, though. It's about the system that lets men like him thrive. You're in a position to change that, Rachel. Don't waste it." Her eyes met his, filled with determination. "I won't. I promise." The next morning, Rachel sat at her desk, a thick file of reports in front of her. As she flipped through the pages, her anger grew. Luke McKinley's name appeared far too often in complaints of excessive force, discriminatory remarks, and abuse of power. Bennett entered with another folder. "More complaints just came in," he said grimly. "Looks like this wasn't an isolated incident." Rachel shook her head, disgusted. How did this go unchecked for so long? "People were afraid to speak up," Bennett said. "Or they didn't think it would matter." "Well, it matters now," Rachel said, her voice cold. "Every one of these cases will be reopened. If anyone else in this precinct is complicit, I want them gone." Luke McKinley sat in his small, sparsely furnished apartment, the suspension notice still lying on his kitchen table. He hadn't left the house since Rachel had confronted him, avoiding the judgmental eyes of the community. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. His brother answered on the first ring. "Luke, what the hell did you do?" his brother snapped. Luke clenched his jaw. "It's not what it looks like. It looks like you assaulted a veteran and got yourself suspended. Do you have any idea how bad this is for the family? For me?" Luke didn't respond, the weight of his actions finally beginning to sink in. He hung up without another word, staring at the badge sitting on the counter. For the first time, he wondered if he truly deserved to wear it. 2 weeks later, the precinct held a public meeting. Rachel stood before a packed room of officers and community members, her father seated in the front row. "The past few weeks have been a reckoning for this precinct," Rachel began. "We've uncovered patterns of behavior that are unacceptable, unethical, and unworthy of the badge we wear. Let me be clear, this stops now." She detailed the changes she was implementing: mandatory training, stricter oversight, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. She also announced McKinley's permanent dismissal from the force, a decision met with applause from the audience. As Rachel spoke, she glanced at her father. He gave her a small nod, pride evident in his eyes. After the meeting, Rachel and Henry walked together through the park, the cool evening air refreshing after the tension of the day. "You did good, Rachel," Henry said. "I learned from the best," she replied, smiling. Henry stopped, looking out at the horizon. "This isn't the end, you know. There's still so much work to do." Rachel nodded. "I know, but at least it's a start." The two walked on, side by side, their bond stronger than ever. Though the road ahead was long, they were ready to face it together. The following week, Henry sat on his porch, the evening sun casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. His torn jacket had been mended, though the faint line of stitching still reminded him of the coffee shop incident. Yet he felt no bitterness, only a sense of purpose. The small act of mending his jacket reminded him of the resilience he'd carried through life. As a young man in the military, as a father raising a daughter alone after his wife passed, and now, as an elder facing the same prejudices he thought he'd left behind. The sound of footsteps brought him back to the present. Rachel was walking up the path, a thick envelope in her hand. "Dad," she called, her voice a mix of relief and pride. "I wanted to bring this to you." "What's this?" he asked, gesturing for her to sit beside him. She handed him the envelope. Inside was a formal letter from the precinct, detailing the actions taken against Officer McKinley, along with a handwritten note of apology from the precinct's officers who supported Rachel's reforms. Henry read the letter carefully, then folded it back with deliberate slowness. "You didn't have to do all this," he said softly, though his eyes shone with gratitude. "Yes, I did," Rachel replied. "This isn't just about you. It's about every person like you who's been mistreated and ignored. You taught me that leadership means standing up for what's right. This is my way of honoring that." Henry smiled, pride filling his heart. "You've always been stronger than you think, Rachel." Meanwhile, Luke McKinley sat in the dim light of his apartment, staring at his police badge lying on the kitchen counter. The dismissal letter from the precinct sat unopened beside it. Days had passed since his suspension became official. The walls of his once proud world were crumbling. His arrogance had shielded him for years, but now he couldn't escape the weight of his actions. He replayed the coffee shop incident in his mind, this time noticing things he hadn't before. Henry's calm dignity, the scar on his shoulder, the quiet way he walked away despite the humiliation. Luke wasn't used to self-reflection, but now it consumed him. He realized how many others he'd wronged, how his power had corrupted him. Finally, he picked up the letter. He read it slowly, every word a reminder of the life he'd thrown away. For the first time in years, he felt something resembling regret. Not because he'd been caught, but because he finally saw the humanity in the people he'd dismissed. Back in the coffee shop where it all began, the owner, a kind-hearted woman named Mrs. Evelyn Davis, was preparing for a small gathering. Word of Henry's ordeal had spread quietly through the community, and many residents wanted to show their support. Henry entered the shop, his repaired jacket proudly worn, and was greeted with a warm cheer. A group of veterans from the neighborhood presented him with a new patch for his jacket, embroidered with the words, "Dignity in Service." "You've always been a pillar of strength, Henry," Mrs. Davis said, handing him a cup of coffee. "This is our way of saying thank you." Henry was touched. "I don't need all this fuss," he said with a smile, "but I appreciate it." Rachel arrived shortly after, joining her father at a table. Together, they watched as people mingled and shared stories, the atmosphere filled with hope and solidarity. A few days later, Luke McKinley stood outside the coffee shop, unsure if he should go in. He was no longer wearing his uniform. Instead, he was dressed in plain clothes, his posture less rigid, more unsure. Inside, Henry sat alone, sipping his coffee and reading. The sight of the man he'd wronged filled Luke with shame, but also determination. Taking a deep breath, he walked inside. The room quieted as people noticed him. Conversations hushed. Eyes followed his every move. Luke approached Henry's table, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Williams," Luke began, his voice low but sincere. I came to apologize for what I did, for how I treated you." Henry looked up, his expression unreadable. He set his book down slowly. "Go on," he said, his tone even. "I was wrong," Luke continued. "Not just about you, but about a lot of things. I let my prejudices blind me, and I abused my power. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry." The room seemed to hold its breath as Henry studied the man before him. Finally, he spoke. "Apologies are a start," he said. "But real change comes from what you do next. Words are easy. Actions take courage." Luke nodded, his face pale but determined. "I understand. I'm going to make things right, starting with myself." Henry gave a small nod, then picked up his book again, signaling the conversation was over. Luke turned and left the shop, the weight of his mistakes still heavy, but a spark of hope ignited within him. Months later, Rachel and Henry stood in front of a newly unveiled plaque at the precinct. It read, "In honor of Henry Williams, a reminder of integrity, justice, and service." The precinct had undergone significant changes. Training programs were in place, officers held each other accountable, and the culture was shifting. Rachel's leadership had set a new standard, one that the community had begun to trust. As Henry read the plaque, his heart swelled with pride, not just for the honor, but for the change it symbolized. "You've done well, Rachel," he said. "We've done well, Dad," she replied. "Together." The story ended not with triumph, but with progress, slow, steady, and hard-earned. Henry's quiet resilience and Rachel's fierce determination had left a lasting mark, proving that justice wasn't just an ideal, but a commitment to action. And as Henry walked out of the precinct, the scar on his shoulder felt less like a burden and more like a badge of honor, a reminder of battles fought and lessons learned. Months had passed since Luke McKinley had been dismissed from the force. His life had taken a sharp turn. No badge, no uniform, and no respect from a community he'd once ignored. For a while, he wallowed in self-pity. But Henry's words, "Real change comes from what you do next," echoed in his mind. Luke decided it was time to face himself. He began volunteering at a local veterans outreach center, a place he'd never paid attention to before. The work wasn't easy. He spent long hours listening to stories of struggle and resilience from men and women who had served their country, many of whom looked like Henry. One afternoon, as Luke helped set up chairs for a support group, an older man approached him. "You're the ex-cop, right?" the man asked. Luke nodded, bracing for judgment. "You messed up," the man said bluntly. "But you're here now. That counts for something." Those words stayed with Luke as he continued to show up day after day, slowly earning the trust of the people he once looked down on. Meanwhile, Henry's quiet strength continued to inspire change. At the Veterans Center, where he volunteered weekly, he noticed a growing number of young men and women seeking guidance. Many had faced discrimination or struggled to find their place in the community after returning from service. Henry became a mentor, sharing his story not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to resilience. "Your scars," he would say, "are proof that you survived. Wear them with pride, but don't let them define you." One evening, as Henry wrapped up a group session, Rachel arrived, still in her uniform. "You've been busy, Dad," she said with a smile. Henry chuckled. "Just trying to leave the world a little better than I found it." "Well, you're doing a better job than most," Rachel replied. Rachel's reforms at the precinct had taken root. She'd overhauled the training program, introducing mandatory sessions on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement. Officers who resisted the changes didn't last long under her leadership. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. Not everyone welcomed the new direction, and Rachel faced criticism from within and outside the department. Still, she pressed on, her father's quiet courage fueling her resolve. During a town hall meeting, Rachel addressed the community directly. Change is never easy, she said, but it's necessary. Our job is to protect and serve every single person in this community, without exception. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Her words were met with applause, but it was the quiet nod from Henry in the front row that meant the most to her. One day, while Rachel and Henry were walking through the park, they saw Luke McKinley standing near a group of veterans at an outdoor event. He was no longer the arrogant officer they remembered. Dressed casually, he looked humbled, yet purposeful, as he handed out supplies and spoke to the veterans with genuine respect. Rachel glanced at her father. "Do you want to talk to him?" she asked. Henry thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No need. He's on his path now. That's enough for me." As they walked away, Luke noticed them. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Luke gave a small nod, acknowledgement, gratitude, and a silent promise to do better. The story closes with Henry sitting on his porch once more, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His repaired jacket, now adorned with the Dignity in Service patch, hung beside him. Rachel joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know," Henry said, "if someone had told me all this would come from one bad day at a coffee shop, I'd have laughed them off." Rachel smiled. "Life has a funny way of turning things around." Henry took a sip of his coffee, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not perfect. It never will be. But it's better. And that's worth something." As the evening settled into night, the father and daughter sat in companionable silence, their bond unshaken, their legacy of justice and resilience quietly shaping the world around them.